For 12 years, the town ignored the chained dog behind Clyde Weaver's trailer until a tornado snapped the post and set him loose. Days later, he returned, but not with teeth or fury. He just sat at Clyde's porch and stared. But what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. There are places in America where things rot in plain sight, and no one says a word. Pine Ridge was one of them. A rust-splotched patch of trailers and sagging porches tucked behind cornfields and a shuttered gas station. It was the kind of town where a scream might echo for hours and still go unanswered. At the back edge of this forgotten grid lived Clyde Weaver. His trailer leaned slightly downhill, as if exhausted with the years. The siding had peeled back in sheets, exposing the dull pink insulation beneath. Rust laced the gutters. A plastic kiddie pool, long since dried and cracked, sat flipped near the steps like an artifact from a life that never really was. And behind the trailer, chained to a bent metal post anchored in concrete, lived the dog. The neighbors called him Brutus. Clyde never called him anything at all. Brutus had once been a powerful Rottweiler, block-headed, square-chested, bred to intimidate. But after 12 years of weather and wire and no kindness, the power had wasted off him like dust in the wind. His coat was splotchy from mange. His teeth were yellowed, his back legs slightly bowed. The chain around his neck had rusted into itself and bit deep into the flesh. The skin beneath it was black and wet, scabbed in places where old collars had long since fused with scar tissue. He didn't bark unless something moved. He didn't move unless he had to. His territory was a patch of hard-packed dirt, worn to the root by years of pacing, turning, curling. No grass dared grow there. The shade came from a rotted plywood lean-to nailed to 2 cinder blocks. If it rained, the runoff hit Brutus first. If it snowed, the wind pressed ice straight into his ribs. Clyde Weaver didn't care. No one really knew what Clyde did anymore. Once he worked maintenance at the grain elevator, then he just stopped. After his wife left, or vanished, depending on who you asked, he mostly sat on his porch with a beer and a bitter scowl. Local kids learned to ride their bikes faster past his place. Adults pretended not to look when they turned off the main road. Everyone knew about the dog. Everyone. But Pine Ridge wasn't a town that stepped in. It was a town that stepped around. Every so often, someone new, a mail carrier, a volunteer, would try to report it. They'd call animal control. Once, maybe twice. Then Clyde would show up at the station with a smile that didn't touch his eyes and a story about how some city folk don't understand country ways. He had a permit for the dog. The chain was legal. The food was provided. And if you pushed too hard, well, folks had a way of minding their own. But not all minds could rest easy. Angela Monroe, who lived 2 trailers down, used to slip out at dusk with a paper plate of scrambled eggs. She'd leave them just out of Brutus's reach, knowing full well he'd drag the chain until his paws bled to get them. Her husband found out and made her stop. "He's not our problem," he said. "Besides, that dog's mean." But Brutus had never bitten anyone, never lunged, never snapped. He watched, always watched. Eyes full of something that wasn't rage, but something older, something slower, something that waited. And so he sat, for 12 years, through July heat waves and January ice storms, through power outages and thunder, through kids growing up and leaving and coming back different, through Clyde's threats and beer cans and blackouts, through every siren, every call, every silence. He watched. And then one summer afternoon, a storm rolled over the plains, fast, dark, and angry. One of those backhand tornadoes that didn't care what year it was. It peeled the roof off Clyde's trailer like a sardine lid, tore out a dozen trees, toppled power poles, and in the wreckage, the chain post, the one rusted deep into the concrete, snapped at the base. When the wind cleared, Brutus was gone. No bark, no blood, just the chain, curled like a dead snake in the dust. The silence came first. Not a single bark echoed from Clyde's yard in the days after the storm. No chain clinking against steel. No low groan from behind the trailer when someone passed too close. For the first time in over a decade, the town forgot what it was to be watched. Some said Brutus was dead, swept up by the storm, hurled into the fields like a scarecrow and never found. Others said the chain had killed him as it snapped, crushed his throat, broke his neck. But Angela Monroe didn't believe that. She said it quiet, to no one in particular. He waited too long to die like that. 2 days after the tornado, the signs started. Kyle and Tammy Miller found their porch screen sliced open. Not mangled, not destroyed, just lifted, clawed at the edge, like a surgical hand had worked through it with purpose. They had no pets, no kids, but something had entered, moved the old water dish, and left again. Then came the backyard sightings. Margie Ross, 74, told her bridge group she'd seen a black bear-shaped dog walking past her clothesline at dawn. She said it didn't look lost. It looked like it remembered the way. No one laughed. They all knew who she meant. Brutus didn't show himself fully. Not yet. He appeared like guilt. Sudden, partial, undeniable. A blurry figure behind the bushes. 2 yellow eyes catching headlights near the edge of a pasture. A low shuffle on gravel that made your stomach twist without knowing why. But the real turning point was the Wilcox backyard. The Wilcoxes were known for their manicured garden. Flower beds bordered in stone, a white bench by the maple tree, and an old cedar doghouse no one had used since 2010. Their lab, Scout, had died that winter. The doghouse had been left as tribute, unoccupied and untouched. One morning, a muddy paw print streaked across the bench. Grass flattened near the doghouse. Inside, the faint heat of something heavy, recently resting. It wasn't vandalism, nothing stolen, nothing torn up. Just a ghost, politely borrowing shelter. Word spread fast. In a town that rarely spoke plainly, whispers carried weight. Brutus was back. But he wasn't staying still. By the end of that week, 6 separate homes reported strange visitations. A missing steak from a grill, wet prints along a dock, a tipped-over bird bath. All of it strangely calm. Never aggressive, but always specific. He didn't wander. He retraced. Brutus was mapping the town, revisiting the periphery of places that had once stared at him from across the fence, the ones who watched but never helped. He circled their memories like wolves circle fire, silent, knowing, patient, and it changed people. Angela Monroe started leaving her porch light on. Not to scare him, to guide him. A soft beacon, flickering beside a bowl of warm broth. She didn't expect thanks. She just wanted him to know she remembered. Others weren't so brave. Hank Grady boarded up the side of his tool shed. "Just in case," he muttered. He'd once hit Brutus with a rake for growling too close to his toddler. The boy was 18 now. The guilt had aged harder. Kids at the bus stop no longer joked about the zombie dog story. They waited quieter, heads low. Everyone was watching the fields now. Not for fear, for reckoning. Brutus never chased. He never growled. But something in his movement said more than teeth ever could. The dog was retracing a wound, and it had cut through every backyard in town. Clyde Weaver came back to Pine Ridge exactly 14 days after the storm. He didn't tell anyone he was returning. Just showed up at dusk in his dented pickup, dragging a borrowed trailer full of salvaged scrap. His roof was still half missing. One wall had caved in. The back door hung open on a single hinge, and the only thing holding the place upright was whatever hate he still carried in his chest. He parked with a grunt, stepped out, and lit a cigarette like nothing had changed. Except one thing had. The chain was still there. The collar, too. But it was empty now, limp and twisted on the ground like a discarded memory. Clyde stared at it for a moment, then spit. Good riddance. He assumed the dog was dead. Or someone else's problem. Either way, he didn't care. The town could whisper all it wanted. Clyde was home again, and the world could go back to pretending nothing ever happened on his dirt. But the town had changed. People watched Clyde differently now, with a tightness in their expression. The gas station clerk didn't meet his eye. Kyle Miller didn't wave when their trucks passed. Even the sheriff's deputy, the one Clyde used to drink with, handed back his driver's license without a word. They all knew. Not what would happen, but what should. And that expectation hung in the air like humidity. 3 nights after Clyde returned, the dog came back. It was just after midnight. The wind was still, the sky moonless. Clyde sat on his porch in a folding chair, beer in one hand, cigarette in the other, radio static playing from inside. He didn't hear Brutus arrive. He felt it. A shift in the atmosphere. A presence heavy enough to drag breath. He looked up. At the edge of the yard, just beyond the cracked sidewalk, stood the dog, Brutus. He was broader now, older too, with patches of fur missing and a jagged scar down his side. His eyes gleamed amber in the porch light. They didn't blink. Clyde stood instinctively. Well, look what the cat dragged in. Brutus didn't move. Clyde smirked. Took you long enough? What, come to bite the hand that fed you? Still no movement, just staring. But the stare wasn't rage. It wasn't even threat. It was witness. Clyde chuckled nervously and stepped forward, raising his voice. You ain't got the guts, mutt. You never did. Brutus sat. That simple movement, calm, deliberate, final, did more than any growl. Clyde froze. The dog wasn't there to fight. He was there to outlast. For 12 years, Clyde had chained silence to a post. Now silence had come unchained, and it was staring him down with the full weight of memory. Clyde took a step back. Brutus didn't follow. He didn't rise. He didn't twitch. He just sat like a statue carved from pain, like a monument to everything Clyde thought had been buried. Hours passed. The beer went warm in Clyde's hand. The cigarette burned to ash. The radio inside crackled and cut out. Still the dog sat. Still the man stared. But it was Clyde who broke first. At 3:41 a.m., Clyde stepped inside and closed the door. Slowly, quietly, like someone closing the lid on something he was afraid might scream. When the sun rose, Brutus was gone. But the ground where he sat was still warm. And Clyde Weaver didn't sit on his porch again. Brutus never came back after that night. At least, not to Clyde's trailer. Some say they saw him once more, slinking along the ridgeline at dawn, silhouette cut against the sky like a piece of something ancient. Others whispered he'd crossed the fields to an old farm on the edge of the next county, where the owner left out scraps and never asked questions. But no one saw him in Pine Ridge again, not clearly, not entirely. He left like smoke, slow, silent, and impossible to catch. But the air didn't forget. Not the yards he passed, the porches he paused under, the children he never barked at. Pine Ridge didn't speak of him the way people talk about animals. They spoke of him like weather, something that swept through and changed the way things grew after. At first, they called it curiosity. Then they called it guilt. But eventually, the truth settled in. It was respect. And so, For the first time in Pine Ridge's quiet, uncomfortable history, someone acted. It was Angela Monroe who did it. She walked down to Clyde's old trailer, now abandoned for good, sold for scrap, windows busted and chain-link gate bent backward. The post where Brutus had once been tethered still stood, though it leaned slightly now, as if tired. The chain lay curled around it, a tangle of rust and memory. She brought a hammer, a piece of scrap wood, a rusted dog collar she'd found in her shed. She didn't make a speech. She didn't need to. She nailed the collar to the post. Then, with a black marker, she scrawled onto the wood. Not neatly, not straight, but clear. He waited 12 years. Then he chose mercy. By nightfall, someone had added a candle. By morning, someone else had left a bowl of water. Within a week, flowers began to appear. Not in bouquets, but single stems. A dandelion, a daisy, a branch of pine. No one organized it. No one announced anything. But every person who had ever walked past that chained dog and looked away, they came. Not to weep, but to remember. Because Brutus didn't burn the town down. He didn't bite. He didn't destroy. He didn't even bark. He stared them down with the truth of who they had been, and then turned away. And that was worse. He forced them to live not with fear, but with reflection. Even the sheriff, who'd retired the year before, stopped by. Stood for a full 5 minutes with his hand on the post. He never said what he thought about. But when he left, he looked older. Years later, when the property was sold to a developer, the new owners tried to remove the post. It wouldn't come loose. The bolts were rusted deep into the concrete, and every time they brought in a crew to cut it down, something happened. A busted blade, a flooded trench. One guy even broke his wrist falling off the backhoe. The contractor gave up after the third attempt. "It's not worth it," he muttered. "Let the damn thing stand." And so it did. A bent post, a nailed collar, a sentence on a board. And everyone who passed it knew the story. Even the children, even the newcomers. They knew who Brutus was, and what he did, and more importantly, what he didn't. He didn't take revenge. He didn't become what they made him. He just broke free, and held a mirror up to the town that failed him. And sometimes the hardest punishment is mercy.